Sira Code. The truth stands on its own foundation. Lies are built on great towers. Coincidence is the truth willing events to reveal itself. Chapter 1. Lisena Rishi sat on a bench outside the PIM Training Center administration block. There was a great multitude of recruits, all aspiring to be guards of the PIM army in one of two classes, either Ark or Infantry. Lisena had qualified to be part of the Ark Guard, the spell casting regiment. Selection was based on the availability of ruin particles and the concentration of the particles in the blood. There was no basis for being born with ruin blood, or genetic inheritance of it. The presence of ruin was decided by divine chance, a random selection of the gods, a natural selection of the world, granting some the ability to handle magic for a sustained period of time, whereas others could not. Lisena remembered the day she was accepted. She had gone to the recruitment center, a large mobile tent that the Kingdom Guard had pitched when they arrived in her town, a temporary measure to serve the purpose, since her remote village they didn't have permanent guard officers. At the entrance stood two commanders dressed in full uniform. She had walked in, received a scroll to write down her personal details, and once handed in, she went to the next table, where the nurses, who were Ark guards in their own right, extracted a pinprick of blood off a finger, mixed it with chemicals unknown to her, and after a few minutes of waiting outside the tent with a multitude of people, some she knew and others total strangers, she got her acceptance letter, which stated that she was accepted for the Ark Guard. She remembered screaming and jumping up and down with the others, who had received like news. Those that didn't have ruin particles were selected for the Infantry Guard, that is, those that couldn't use the more powerful magic, but still trained in the use of spears, bows, arrows, and swords. Not to say they couldn't cast spells. Anyone with basic arcology, the knowledge of drawing arc spells with a wand, could cast spells. But when it came to surviving the spiritual strain of spell casting, the art of Tswara, or summoning a totem, one had to have ruin blood, which gave the initiator of magic a superior edge. Infantry combat skills, though, were still mandatory to learn and excel at, especially if one wanted to be a seer, a true master. Spellcasting was only good for long to short range combat, for once someone got within arm's reach, spellcasting was close to useless, and therefore one had to master hand-to-hand combat. The primary reason was the nature of spellcasting. One couldn't just create spells by mindlessly waving a wand around. Arcing was like scribing, with certain movements creating certain spells. The bigger the spells, the longer the arcs. Some spells were voice activated as well, yet others required both arcs and voice commands to work. This made spellcasting at close combat extremely difficult, as whilst one was arcing a spell, an adversary could strike them down with a sword before the spell came into existence. Lisena looked around at the individuals at the training camp. They came from all over the kingdom, all aspiring to make it into the Kingdom Guard, maybe even into the Royal Guard, and ultimately become a seer. There are so many of us, Barden said, peering around at the crowd gathered around them. Barden Black was Lisena's best friend. They came from the same village, out in the farthest district of Pim, Kutan. Since he didn't have ruin blood, he was going to train for the Infantry Guard. This would be Barden's second attempt. He had tried the previous year, when he was 15, and had failed dismally, but managed 2 weeks of the elimination month. He had told Lisena how tough and ruthless it was, describing the painful exercises, lack of sleep, and the cruel commanders, relentless in their application of the drills. Lisena's aunt didn't want to even hear the word God in her province, let alone the house. That whole year after the selections had been done, Lisena and her aunt had been at ends with each other. Her fears were from her brother, Lisena's father, who had died in the service of his king, and she projected her fears over and above onto Lisena. Eventually, she realized that serving under the guard was like a Rishi obligation and tradition. So it eventually happened that when she had turned 16, her aunt gave in and allowed her to try. They sat together on a bench assessing all the events around them, slowly coming to the realization that this was probably the last time they would be together, as once training began, to each his own. "We should be fine," Lisena said, but inside her gut twisted and turned, the butterflies desperate to get out. The two friends were from a small village that barely had any recruits here, outside of Barden and herself. Sitting there, she wondered where all the girls and boys she'd celebrated with at the selection tent had disappeared to. All around her, recruits from other provinces stood in groups, looking so confident and sure of themselves. Some coming from villages with seasoned recruit bases, others like herself, children of former kingdom guards. "We will be fine," she reassured herself, more than actually speaking to Barden. "After all, we got this far." Barden nodded in agreement. The journey to Pim for the two was monumental. As there was no direct carriage in their town, they had to travel for a day up to the main city of Kutan, where they were picked up by royal carriages, gigantic 16-horse-drawn carriages with bottom decks for sitting and a top deck for laying down. One just had to climb up, each capable of carrying 30 individuals, through the kingdom to the training center in the province of Habatek, a painful fortnight on the road. Along the way, each town they passed, they were greeted with cheers and, as mandated by the king, provided with food and shelter to refresh, unless it was a city where they would stay at Kingdom Guard offices. This evening, they shared a tent as they didn't qualify to sleep in the barrack dorms, and they would not see the inside of the dorms until they had completed and survived the first month. They spent the night fantasizing about their futures, what they would learn, how high they would go. Commander, Major, General, Seerah. Unfortunately for Barden, only an Ark Guard could become a Seerah. An infantry guard's maximum would be General or High General, head of all infantry guards. Unlike Ark Guards, who were in charge for kingdom-wide security and sometimes beyond Pim borders, infantry guards usually became a large part of the royal and provincial guards. Lisena was not sure when she slept, but a large horn blared her out of her dreams. She could hear a commander shouting for them to roll up their tents and prepare for the parade. She popped her head out of her tent to assess what was transpiring. There was near pandemonium as recruits scurried like cockroaches, exposed to sudden sunlight, cutting down their tent poles and hurriedly wrapping up their tents. "Bibi, get up!" Lisena screamed. Barden was still rolled up in his sleeping tent, mumbling away his resistance. "Get up!" Lisena repeated, kicking his feet. He popped awake, absorbing his environment. "We have to go to the parade!" Barden's eyes widened. "Are we late?" "On our way to be," Lisena exclaimed. Miraculously, after speedily breaking down their tent, Lisena found herself standing in the front line. The commanders had them group up into their two outfits. On the left, the infantry, and on the right, the arcs, meaning Lisena and Barden had been separated, and the feel of destiny, to each his own, became glaringly evident. They had left all their luggage back at the sleeping fields, all rolled up, and now stood in long lines in front of the admin block, which was a small brick building that mimicked the front of a small castle, with two towers on either corner. A large pulpit had been placed in the center of the admin area, overlooking the recruits. They stood there, waiting patiently, quietly, with the commanders watching them with critical eyes. There was movement now coming out of the admin area. The large doors opened, and majors strolled out. They wore their full armor, the beautiful red and black signature of the guard uniform, the colors of Pim. Each major had a long black cape that hung behind them as they lined up. Out of the long, neat lines emerging from the admin building, there was a shiny white-dressed figure at the end. She slowly burst into the light, her large white gown glistening in the early morning sun. She held her hands clasped together, concealed by the long sleeves of the gown. On her sleeves, red circles were stitched that created two lines over her clasped hands. On her neck hung a large gold necklace, with a round pendant hanging at the end. The inscription was too far to see, but all recruits knew what that pendant was. The gown was given to Siras, and the pendant was given to the Grand Sira, the highest ranking official in the Kingdom Guard, the head of all infantries and arcs, the master of the masters. Disena's mind drifted away, imagining herself draped in that apparel as the Grand Sira, walking towards the podium. With each step, an unspoken stamp of authority and respect etched out. Lisena wondered what she was capable of. Her arc skills, combat prowess, all hidden under the gown, and her face seemingly so normal. Her hair was braided in neat lines, running to the back of her head, where they culminated in a bun, held in place by two protruding sticks. She stood at the podium for a moment, acknowledging the crowd of people in front of her. In a liquid move that was barely noticeable, with her large robe, she pulled out a wand, roughly 30 centimeters long. Within the same movement of pulling the wand, she arced a spell. The movement she made created an arc trail that showed the arc she had made, but it was too brief for the untrained eye to even register the symbols that floated briefly in the air before dissipating. She then placed her wand onto the podium, where it balanced itself, remaining upright, no doubt part of the spell. The tip of the wand glowed a dull yellow in the morning light. Greetings, in the name of Yameva. The voice of the Grand Seer was as loud as the roar of a dragon. It reverberated around the whole field, audible to all recruits. Clearly that was the spell she had cast, some type of personification aimed at her own voice. Greetings in the name of Yameva, who was the supreme god, was a common greeting in Pim, which was followed by the name of the king. Courage, wisdom, temperance, humility, that is the core of the kingdom guard, as she continued. Desena wondered where Barden was standing. She really felt the need to share such an exciting moment with her village friend, but peering down the long front line, she couldn't see him. Being a kingdom guard is the greatest honor, the Grand Sira continued. Desena leaned forward ever so slightly to get a better view. The commanders in front of her, too busy listening to the Grand Sira to notice, didn't see her bent out of formation. She leaned back, turning her head slightly to see if she could catch a glimpse of Barden behind the first line. Stand fast! The command was sharp, making Desena snap into the upright position, hands straight by her side. She found herself staring straight ahead. Oddly though, the commander directly in front of her had his eyes fixed on the Grand Sira. She frowned, wondering who had spoken. She turned her gaze to the Grand Sira. Any later, she may have missed the look, but their eyes met for a brief moment before the Grand Sira's eyes continued to wander over the recruits. But that contact was all she needed. In that moment, she knew that the Grand Sira had seen her distracted pose and corrected her. Desena was astonished. How? She knew Siras were able to do a great many things, but telepathy was not one of them. Yet she was sure that the Grand Sira had spoken to her. As her mind tried to make sense of what had just transpired, Desena kept her gaze on the Grand Sira, listening to each word she spoke, her mind in perpetual cyclic questioning. Are they that powerful? Many of you will make the training, and I say to you, never give up. Try again, the Grand Sira continued. And even if you are not part of the Kingdom Guard, Know that as a child of Pim, you have an obligation to always protect your nation, no matter in what capacity. And to those who are selected, I say to you, selection is only the beginning of the great journey to becoming a god. Never become complacent. Work always until training becomes habit. Habit becomes who you are. For the glory of Pim. Hurrah! The crowd of recruits all replied. The Grand Seer, using 2 fingers, grabbed the wand, allowing it to twirl before she held it and arced another sequence very briefly, probably to cancel out the first spell. The wand disappeared under her robe and her hands returned together in front of her, restoring the pattern of circles of the robe. As she turned, everyone saw the large symbol on her back, the symbol of a Sarah. She walked away, retreating behind the doors of the administration building. "What are you doing standing there like a buck on blue? Marta, Marta! You think you're ox? You're less than asses. Move, move, move!" The commanders all shouted in various Pim dialects, throwing all recruits into confused disarray. But the message was very clear. Training had begun. As the doors of the admin block closed, the Grand Seer turned to General Iris on her right. "Please inform Sir David I wish to meet him." "As you wish, Grand Seer," General Iris said. She was Sir David's apprentice, and as such, she had to know where he was at all times. Those without apprentices had escorts likened to personal assistants that would serve as the custodians of the whereabouts of the Seer. "I had returned for the introduction, but I will be heading to him shortly," General Iris said. "Very good," the Grand Seer responded. The general bowed and ported out of sight. The Grand Seer wove an arc and appeared in the castle. The kingdom castle had an arrival room for all arcs. This was because the king did not wish for castle grounds to be full of arcs appearing and disappearing as they pleased, as was the case at Seer headquarters. Given that the castle represented the people of Pim and had many maids and manservants that were non-Ruan bloods, the king wanted the entire grounds to be a sort of non-magic zone as to truly represent the people. Outside the arrival room, maids waited to escort anyone who arrived to their destination. In this case, they would escort the Grand Seer on her way. From the arrival room, there was a guard station that they passed through, where they were checked and vetted. Then they journeyed in a carriage to the main castle. It was all for the general security of the castle grounds. It was actually refreshing for the Grand Seer to travel physically. Over the decades, as she grew in skill, she realized that the less one practiced magic, the more one became connected to the world, and ultimately the elements, which themselves were the foundation of our ecology. So it was a paradox. At the beginning, more knowledge and spell casting were necessary, but at the end, less spells was more knowledge. Now as she traveled up the long stone path, she appreciated what her ancestors had built. The king's castle, named King's Crown, or Castle Crown, indeed lived up to its name. Just like a king's crown, it had large towers rising up into the sky on all sides. It had been built after the war had ended in the east, when the city of Dan, after being the resistance of the people of Pim from the mages, was seen as too close to the outlands, and its vulnerability posed as a security problem. Hence Castle Crown was created, farther to the west, closer to the mountains, which provided some cover in case of attack, forcing large armies to take the easier eastern route, which became a funnel and a slaughter gauntlet. Those armies that tried to brave the mountains were defeated by the elements, and whatever came down the mountain was mopped up by the kingdom guard. Regardless of its evident grandeur, it took a short time to complete. This was due to the help of arcs. Their magics, made what would have taken years take months. They assisted now in the far corner of the castle. Major renovations were taking place, extending what was already a monumental structure into an even grander monstrosity. The Grand Seer was not too pleased though, as outside of the garden there was very little green here, unlike Seer headquarters, that was integrated with nature, as the elements were a source of true knowledge. Along the path there were sculptures of former kings that had ruled the lands. At the very center, in front of the main entrance, stood the statue of Grand Seer Rishi, and at her side the first king, crowned after the Great War, King Roshan. Their unity was the unity that made Pim excel, a common understanding between royalty and sorcery. The Seer would be protectors of the kingdom under the king, and would answer to no one but the king. Inasmuch as they swore allegiance to the king, they operated generally autonomously in their training methods, ideals, and rules, as long as those rules didn't overrule the kingdom. However, there was the Seer law, as written by the first Grand Seer, that stood as law above all in the kingdom, and those even the king was bound by. So the Seer would not wage war, but could attack a threat even if they had not been ordered or permitted to do so, especially if the threat is of magic in nature, but generally they operated under the king's command. With the great power they possessed, it was only appropriate that one who did not have their power be given authority over their actions, a check and balance of sorts. When the carriage arrived, a red carpet extended to the entrance of the castle. A maid waited with an umbrella to cover the Seer, but she raised a hand. Seer enjoyed the sunlight. Again, connection to the elements. She was led, though she knew the way, to the king's council room. She always marveled at the level of materialism of the castle. Pictures with gold frames lined the walls, gold trim on the curtain rails. Even the maid that escorted her had some type of minor jewelry on them, gold or silver. The floor they walked had tiles cleaned so well they presented as mirrors where one could assess themselves as they went about their business. The only jewelry the Grand Seer had was the necklace that she had been given, the sign of the Grand Seer, by the king and not of her own acquiring, and the crowns that she wore on her store hand. Those too were made of gold. Otherwise, Seers pulled away from materialism, as the love for those only led to a destruction of the elements. Outside of her necklace and finger crowns, she had leather on her arm straps, wand holder, and her boots, a few brass pins in her hair, and she was done. The rest was fabric. King Roshan II was the descendant of General Roshan, who led the royal armies aided by Lisa Torment many centuries ago. The war against the mages had killed off his four uncles' lineage, leaving the throne to fall to his forefather, who after his victorious return from the north was crowned the new king of Pim. At the time, the kingdom was still very small, with Dan and Apex the only two provinces that aligned to the king. Over the decades, through hard diplomacy without conquest, the 10 provinces were united to become the Kingdom of Pim. King Roshan II was born on a very calm night at the peak of the monsoon season. As such, they likened his character to be one that quells even the most volatile of times, hence giving him the name of his ancestral uncle, the great general. Such diplomacy was necessary now, not necessarily for Pim. Under their reign, Pim had excelled, added by the allegiance of the Seer, the established magicians of Ruinblood who taught only clean magic, but mainly for the diplomatic ties being established in the north. As was Seer law, at birth all heirs were tested for Ruinblood. Any child of royal lineage could not become a king if they had Ruinblood, because the representative of the common man had to be a man without Sira potential. Therefore, since Siras had declared that they would never rule over man, having a king with ruined blood went against the law. King Roshem sat at the head of his Security Council table. To his left sat Aramaros, the king's hand. He was older than the king and a very experienced politician who knew his way around diplomatic situations. To his right sat the Grand Sira Muriel. The two had shared some history together. As mandatory tradition, a king had to undergo infantry training under the Kingdom Guard, and the Grand Sira had been part of the exercises. Beyond that, they had even gone into battle together, defending the lands in the north from raiders that had used the mountains as refuge, and squashing a rebellion in the east set by those who wanted to return to the dark ages of a broken, fragmented kingdom. The king had been younger then, much younger, and the Grand Sira had watched him grow into the old man he now was. His wife, the queen, sat next to the king's hand. She came from the southern kingdom of Ursa in Valbara, the continent in the west. In order to strengthen ties, the king's father arranged the marriage, which created a strong diplomatic relationship with the southern kingdoms of the west. Her presence necessary, as given the sudden death of the king, she would be required to lead until an heir comes of age. The natural protocol was that upon the king's death, the Siras would take command of the kingdom, ensuring peace and stability, while the queen buried her husband and mourned. After 5 months of mourning and Sira rule, she would then go for another 30 days of orientation, a catch-up of events that would have transpired during her mourning months, after which she would be crowned. The system ensured that if the king was killed, the Sira would have time to thoroughly investigate with full power and control without being hindered. History had shown that the closest partners to kings and queens usually did the deed. Again, it deterred anyone who may have thought killing the royal family would give them conquering rights to the throne. Then finally sat the general of the kingdom guard, General Stone, who ran the guard affairs of Apex, as well as the infantry guard. He was slightly older than the Grand Sira in terms of standard years, but looked more like Sira Igor Abel because of his normal human age rate. What was worth admiring was that he moved way above the ability of his years. His expertise and experience were well respected by the Grand Sira and the guard in general. Given his age, retirement was now knocking at the door, and Grand Sira Muriel hoped they could find him a worthy successor. In the corner of the room sat the king's scribes. They recorded every official meeting that the king had to be catalogued and stored for future reference. The king's scribes were sworn to secrecy, and the head scribe, his household, and the library that housed royal scrolls was heavily guarded by infantry commanders. Muriel, welcome. I may have to create a port room within the castle such that your travels may not be delayed, the king said. That would be beneficial, the Grand Sira replied. On to business. Aramaros has spent a month in the north, the king continued. I see they treated you well, as well as they would have treated you had you gone in my stead, sire. In a show of solidarity, they too will send their queen's hand before the queen herself comes down. Splendid. He will be most welcome. I would like to propose, my king, in a spirit of camaraderie, a friendly tournament between the mages in the north and our beloved Sira, a sort of remembrance of the great wars of old, Aramaros said, eyeing the Grand Sira. We wouldn't wish to embarrass our visitors, my king, the Grand Sira stated, and raise tensions or otherwise have them assess our abilities too deeply. It would be a spectacle though, wouldn't you agree? The king asked. Maybe we can find a way to undertake the initiative without offending them. Lower ranked officers maybe. A harmless demonstration, nothing more. After all, it is common practice. As you wish, the Grand Sira bowed, eyeing Aramaros, who smiled wickedly. What of their living quarters? They will be completed within 3 months with the assistance of our As Aramarus correctly said, beloved Sira, we are moving quickly. The entire east wing of the castle has been extended to house 1,500 more guests. As we speak, fabrics from the east continue to arrive. I would hope my king may assess their quality in due course. Oh, I trust your eye, my queen. I hear that our carriages have been raided, General.
Pirates, opportunists, sire. Given the gravity of the undertaking, there are many supply routes to consider, but we are managing. Even with the assistance of the Ark God, the king said. The pirates have their own magicians that allow them to port, which means it's a large game of cat and mouse, as they look for the vulnerable cargo and strike. Considering we have lords arriving from the west, the king continued, I would advise that special resources be made available to ensure their safe arrival. Such important allies, it would be a shame if anything were to happen to them, Aramoros added. Maybe if we had the Sira watching them, it may deter any pirates from attacking. We can provide at the general's request, the Grand Sealer replied. At the king's request, Aramoros countered. The king remained quiet. General, it is your security assessment. I trust you will make the right decision, the king said, standing up, which made them all rise. My queen, those fabrics. The 3 remaining council members bowed and remained so as the king and queen left.
That was eventful. Keep our shipments secure, Muriel. We cannot have any more delays for this day. Of course, Sir Amaros. I do wonder why you propose such a display between mages and Sira. Oh, some variable surprises, I hope. Not much to look forward to then. As with the Great Wars, we won. General, a word. Muriel bowed slightly before turning and exiting the room with the general. Aramaros walked to his quarters, a frustrated man. His assistant came into the room, a dark-haired, skinny man who always seemed hunched over, as though he were preparing to grovel. His name was Adam, and the two had gained acquaintance when Aramaros began his rise through the ranks. The man was extremely resourceful and efficient, coupled with being discreet. He was the perfect assistant. They had worked together, bribing, extorting, threatening, and on occasion disposing of certain individuals, all to meet Aramaros's end. To add, he was not well known in the castle, appearing here and there, but far from official channels, which made him almost a ghost in the hallways of Castle Crown.
Another frustrating meeting, my lord, Adam asked. Minor victories. The Grand Seer has the ear of the king. We need to continue to undermine the relevance of the seer. How can spell-casting paupers be ranked above the king's hand? It's a travesty, my lord, Adam said. I need to discredit the seer, especially the Grand Seer. A suggestion, perhaps. If the seer are to fail in the application of their duties, it would be beneficial, yes? Something they are directly responsible for. Up until now, outside of training the king's guard, they don't have any direct duty. And yet they enjoy all the benefits of the kingdom, all the royal allocations. Aramaros clicked his tongue, flicking his robe as he turned, heading to the window. The assistant Adam bowed excessively low, allowing him to pass. Options, options, the king's hand said, staring out at the expanse of the kingdom.